Hey, welcome to Feature Flags Office Hours. This is the third meeting that we're having, office hours. We do have a question in the agenda. I don't see that Jerome is here, so I'll go ahead and voice over. So this is a follow-up from add test control indicators to the database. There is a issue linked. And in growth, we're leveraging feature flags to run experiments, and we're looking for ways to store the experiment groups and conversations directly in the deployed application's own database. In this case, the deployed application is gitlab.com. And the goal of this is to make it easier for product managers to analyze experiment data rather than trying to track conversations via snowplow events, which live separately from the database. So here's the functionality that we're looking for. Group users into experiment or control based off of their attributes in the deployed application database, i.e. only put users with gold subscriptions into an experiment. So before we're gonna, oh, Jerome, I see that you joined, so you can go ahead and take over. So I'm gonna stop here for a pause because we are looking into adding A/B testing functionality in GitLab. We just completed a round of extensive research around that. So we have a lot of user insights. It's not yet translated into implementation issues, but I believe that in the next week or two, we're gonna have a plan on how to start with that. Now, regarding specifically tiering users or making a group by something, that's something that we already have a functionality we added in the last milestone, the ability to add user lists, which is a list of users that are comma separated, where you could create a user list based off of anything. So you could call a list, gold. The downside of that is that you need to have the list, the full list known. So it's not like a rule where you say, if this equals gold, then just enable a feature. This is currently works for user IDs.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Do you see us being able to have that dynamically generated in the future?
It's a tricky question. The answer is I would love to do that. The complexity on this specific issue is that I'm talking about wider range users. So when we're using our Unleash solution, all the user IDs are third-party IDs, which we don't know. We can talk about a specific use case for GitLab because the GitLab users, we do know them. But the way that we were thinking of overcoming this is creating some kind of script that can populate the list for you based on that. The downside of that is that when you do that, the list is true for that specific moment. If you add or remove users after that, you need to kind of continuously be running the scripts to make sure that the list is up to date. So I don't know if this is a viable workaround, but having that script run as a cron job, like once or twice a day, could be a solution, and then you wouldn't have to, manually fill out thousands of users in the list.
Got it. I think that makes sense. I'll move on to my second point to describe a little bit about what our intention is, at least from a database side. I'll do a really quick screen share. So my second point is we want to be able to record segmentation and record the conversions into the deployed applications database. So speaking specifically about the GitLab application, we've got a users table, and we'll list out all of our users here. And then we also, we're looking at having an experiments table, which could list out all of the experiments which we currently have, or the feature flags that are experiments. So for instance, we could have an experiment called new user onboarding, or the second one could be a free group new purchase flow, etc. And then we'd have something called a user experiments table. And that user experiments table is basically a lookup table of referencing all of the different experiments, session IDs, and the user IDs. And you'd be able to group each of these users by whether they're in the control or the experiment and whether they actually converted. So the intention behind doing this is so that we can actually record the groupings directly in this in the database, and the conversions directly in the database, which makes it a lot easier to track who was part of what, to continue making the experience consistent for them across different sessions, and also be able to understand their conversions. So I just wanted your team's thoughts on adding something like this.
Hey team. I will say that we do have one strategy coming up that can kind of help with that. It's not this, it doesn't give you a full solution yet, but I'm gonna look for it. It's called Flexible Rollout. And in Flexible Rollout, you can choose based on what is going to be the stickiness of your users, but whether it's a session ID or random or things like that. So that may be helpful because you already have the list of users, and based on what the experience is going to be like, be in, and then you can see if it's a feature flag. So some of the data I think we can propagate. I'm not sure about all of them. Shinya, would you want to take a stab at this?
Well, so the one thing I was curious on the table, the proposal, that we're actually the proposal is recording all of the future access, right? Like per session. I think it's going to be crazy amount of insertion rate to our database. So I don't think that's, I'm not sure if it's generally acceptable from database perspective. But I see the points that users, we need to just kind of, monitoring the flag access, which already provided by Launch directly has similar things, and they have a nice, I don't know, like a timeline, like who access the future and what kind of value is returned. I don't know the answer at this moment, but this is something we should track in our product.
Andrew, do you want to voice over what you wrote?
Yeah, let me just collect my thoughts a little bit more here. So our current % rollout strategy is already sticky on user IDs, but there's a hidden group parameter that you can kind of modify to bucket people into groups a little bit. It's run through like a hashing algorithm to determine the percentage, so it's not 100% clear if you modify it which group a user would end up in, which is kind of frustrating. And you can't modify it through the GitLab UI right now anyways. So that's something that we could look at fixing. This would also apply to the flexible rollout strategy, Urit. They have the same group mechanism. But it is already sticky at least. So if you use the % rollout on GitLab today, you should have a consistent experience using the same user ID.
Jerome, I
So-
noticed you use session ID and not user ID in the table.
Regarding, yeah, so there's sort of two reasons for using session versus user. The first one is basically like logged in versus logged out states. A lot of our experiments sort of cross that path. So we'll have an anonymous user come to gitlab.com, and we're going to be testing different sign-up forms for them, right? So at first they're put into one bucket just using their session ID, and then afterwards they successfully log in, then they have a user ID associated with that. So then we try to go back and stitch those two together. So that user experiments table, which you see, even though it may initially have just the session ID, as soon as a user ID is available, we can go back and update that table. It's a similar concept to how most analytics tools do it, using like a identify. And then stitching together that session with that user.
Okay. Then in that case, yeah, the upcoming flexible rollout is probably be more what you're looking for, because then you can the default flexible rollout strategy as well allows you to kind of pin in a prioritized method, if that makes sense. So it'll check for a user ID, and if there's a user ID, it'll pin against that, and then it'll check for a session ID, and if there's a session ID, it'll pin against that, and kind of like cascade in a prioritized order, which might help in this case as well. But you would still need to, I guess, make sure that a user ID and a session ID that are linked together are getting the same experience, but that is something that will probably help out, I think.
Jerome, is it your desire that GitLab's feature flag capability would record some of that analytical state as well then for the customer, so that you don't have to store it in your own database?
Yeah, it'd really help a lot to, over time, you'd be able to look at users, you'd be able to see that, you know, this group of users has been in X number of experiments. And then you can basically do some sort of analysis on, you know, on which experiments users have been in, and see if you can find patterns through that. Because I'm sure as users have different experiences, because they'll each be taking sort of a different journey or a different path, I'm sure that there's some patterns that we can find.
Yeah, which seems more like a analytical data store model. Like us storing that data in the GitLab database is probably a really dangerous idea, right? But it's still, I mean, it's such a useful feature from a feature flag capability. I mean, it pairs very well with the feature flag capability. So if it's not the GitLab database data store, like what would it be that we could, you know, be able to track that data over time?
So
Yeah,
I'm
sorry,
I'm,
go ahead.
I'm kind of thinking, because like there is like a number of different aspects here, which is like from what I hear, like we need to figure out a way to make this process stickiness, maybe either to session or to user, or maybe even both. Because like if you see like if you see some sessions of anonymous user being exposed to some group, you may want to also then kind of stick that to the user in the future for a longer period, which is like the one part, which is like figuring out the stickiness. But the second part is really like eventing system really feels like we want to kind of like be able to use these events to have an understanding if the conversion did happen, if it happened, in what state like the given user were. And like we want to kind of be able to easily query that over a long period of time. It feels to me that it could be like these two topics are kind of disconnected. Maybe like the way here is to kind of treat them disconnected, have like proper eventing system, but really use, I don't know, some kind of BigQuery. It feels like the BigQuery type of the problem, and not really like the GitLab database problem to persist this data. Because like, I mean that the structure of the database is kind of limiting. Like from the structure, I understand this is user-centric, but I don't know if it's like the correct granularity. And I think like we may even over-describe some events to be able to fish over a longer period of time how user interacted with some features that may not be like really something that we can model with the database. My second concern is like with the session ID is like we do not store session ID today in the database because of the amount of the session ID that are there. We use Redis for that. And I'm kind of like wondering, like, every user works with multiple projects, multiple namespaces. It kind of seems to be like a big explosion of the data that we would have to additionally manage. So, I mean, like, if we look at the events problem, is there some good solution that would really allow us to do that? I'm not sure like that events problem is particularly related to our feature flags usage, and it's kind of something bigger that like our feature flags is not like maybe really well designed for that. But the stickiness problem, I think this is something that is very valid, and I think it would be something that would be useful to figure out how to translate it. Why I'm actually like even mentioning about the eventing and stickiness, because in one of the discussions about the experiments, I saw that we really want this stickiness to be used across different applications, which is GitLab Place is one of the applications. We want to know user coming from to about gitlab.com, maybe visiting different pages with the given session, then going to customers gitlab.com, and then kind of like concluding the usage on the gitlab.com. These are all like disconnected applications, and we're not ever gonna have to use gitlab.com unless we expose it through some API. So I'm kind of wondering if we kind of don't look for something that can allow us to work across different applications and like kind of disconnecting these two problems.
I think that the way which you described it makes a lot of sense. I think one of the reasons why we wanted to go with this approach was to not have to rely on an analytics tool so that we could put it directly into the database. I agree that with proper analytics tooling, it solves a lot of this, but that is still work in progress and will probably take another 3 to 6 months maybe. And hopefully we'll have the same, the right level of tracking to allow us to understand which users had which experience and whether they converted or not.
It's really intriguing because like today, even our logs that we generate, they contain a ton of data on how user navigates through application. They give you, you can like check for a like given user what controllers that they visit and how frequently like it uses some parts of the application. And it's kind of data that is available today. Maybe they don't give you like the kind of fine control, but it's a data that can be accessed today. Like our Kibana and ELK, they have like 7-day retention, but we already, like a number of occasions, we put all past logs into like Google BigQuery to even fish for a longer period. So I'm kind of wondering because I guess like it really depends like how like what kind of dashboard you are looking at, because we have a ton of source data that can really answer a lot of these questions about like eventing. Maybe we don't have proper events, but we don't know interactions of people with different features and how frequently. Like we can check exactly how many unique users accessed maybe a given page in a given period, and it's gonna be across different namespaces and across different projects. We could even check exactly, maybe on average, let's say we want to answer the question, how many on average a given user uses projects on a daily basis. Like, we have the data in the logs. It's kind of in the source form. You have to transform that and kind of put that in the BigQuery, but a lot of these questions without even adding this kind of experiments table could be answered today. Maybe this is not the most straightforward, but this is already present there. There is this, I think, important topic about control and experiment. We want to kind of expose users to some of the features and understand their interaction. And this is clearly something that is totally missing. I just don't know exactly how we could approach it, but maybe if the data that we have from the logs, we put that in the BigQuery, maybe this data is become annotated with the user control group in which it is for different experiments that we run on the given time. And then this kind of can give you a kind of a trail on when users to convert on the given period and on what event this happens and what decisions that they made. So it's kind of random, but there is so many tangential topics. But I'm kind of thinking also that this could be interesting thing to look at, that how our solution would integrate with other tools, which is about gitlab.com and customers gitlab.com portal, which leave us completely separate applications. And I know that even for the feature flag system, we use different feature flag engines for all these different applications, which kind of poses some challenges on exactly how to translate the transition of users between these applications, because we cannot really cross-join data between this application and their usages. So,
a few thoughts. The logs piece we have looked at, and trying to build a log parser. That's still potentially on the table, but the approach we've chosen to go with for now is continue using Snowplow and build a Snowplow collector within an instance, which will be able to accomplish roughly the same things, but also allow us to do things like UI events, front-end events, which aren't currently captured in logs. But yeah, that is something that we have explored. Regarding cross-domain testing, you're right that we have different tooling on different applications. You can sort of think of our funnel as someone lands on about.gitlab.com, and then they end up signing up for gitlab.com and getting an account, and then eventually they end up on customers.gitlab.com to actually make a purchase. So if you wanted to test one specific experience across that full funnel, you would need all three of those applications to use a specific experiment, right? And carry that all the way through for that user. The way which it might be possible is if all three of those all use Unleash and you're passing that user ID down onto three different Unleash servers so that you're always providing the same experience.
I'm kind of thinking on completely tangential question. I'm let's say I'm engineer of the CI system, I'm PM of the CI system, and we ship a new awesome feature to the pipelines. I would like to see exactly if people do look for the docs for this feature or not. I would like to learn how frequently people use our docs and what pieces of the docs they are in particularly interested in, maybe what they click to find, maybe what they search, to kind of improve the docs experience and kind of know maybe what aspects may be lacking. it's kind of like completely transitional topic to like what was described. I was kind of like curious about like how people interact with our features and how they find the knowledge.
I think for that, you just need a really good analytics tooling, and you can answer a lot of those questions.
Yeah, at the end of the day, when we're talking about the A/B testing solution, it's going to have to integrate with something in order to give real insights, right? So that's what we're thinking about. Allowing feature flags, connecting it to something. I'm not sure what that something is yet. We maybe start with things internally like UseString or Snowplow or something like that, or maybe something external like Google Analytics. I'm not sure at this moment. But then we want to bring the insights back into the system and have that really visual, so you can see how many people did conversions based on an experiment, and then say, okay, this is what we want for everyone, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that's sort of a question for every A/B testing tool out there, which is like how far do you scope those insights? Do you just focus it on who was part of the experiment versus control and that single conversion event, or do you go deeper down that path and provide all of these other insights and attributes into the user and what led to that conversion?
Yeah. Early to say at the moment where we're going to go, but I assume it's going to be a very slow and iterative process.
That makes sense. I think that answers the questions which I had, which was really just getting some feedback on what we were doing here. I'm not sure, Alex, do you have anything to add or any other questions?
Yeah, I was thinking if since logs also contain a user ID, and since we decided to go with Snowplow for analyzing user conversion, we might as well send along the user ID through Snowplow now. I think legal has given authorization for that. I think Sam Awashek told me. So that might answer the question of analyzing, and that would maybe be our solution, that we don't have to need the need for a database table to store the sessions and the user IDs. But
so regarding whether we can actually track user ID or session ID, or group or namespace IDs at GitLab currently, what the stance which we're taking is we'd like to avoid having that as part of, say, Snowplow or any sort of front-end tracking until we do an update to the privacy policy. And it's mainly because user ID got caught up in the whole previous rollout. I'm not saying that user ID is or isn't covered by our current privacy policy. It's just that we haven't made a very, very clear stance on it with our current privacy policy. So what we're looking at doing is update the privacy policy to explicitly state whether we can track user ID or session ID. And then we can go ahead and add it to something like to Snowplow.
So I'm kind of wondering, is it like about like ID per se, or is it maybe more about anonymous type of tracking? So like kind of creating identifier that you cannot really translate back into the user ID, or is it like the problem of like that we want to track in particular user ID versus we can track identifier that anonymizes the given user because we cannot go back to the source data, but we can still do like the statistical analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things which we were thinking of doing was like a one-way hashing of the user ID so that you can obfuscate the user ID, but still be able to do that statistical analysis so that you can still get your insights. That's one thing that is on the table, which I think will help our users feel a little bit better, because if, for instance, you're looking inside the browser and you're looking inside the Snowplow JavaScript and what data is sent, instead of seeing your user ID or your username, you just see a hash. I think people will be a lot more comfortable with that. So that is definitely one of the things we're also considering.
So I guess then we are really left with the question on how to improve the stickiness of different experiments, because the stickiness is probably like the most important aspect to, with the Snowplow event, to include information about like the plan used for like the given context, but the second, whether the given user is part of the control or experiment. I mean, some kind of like session that you are working with, it's part of the control or experiment.
My understanding for the stickiness right now is that you have your feature toggles, which you describe, and then you have your strategies, and your strategies can be stacked on top of each other, right? Your strategies being, you know, if you want to go with a gradual 50% rollout percentage, and then underneath that, you want to have a list of user IDs that are specifically targeted. And that would, you know, if you meet both of those requirements, if you get put into that 50% bucket and you're part of that user list, then you end up in the, what I would call the experiment, because you're part of that feature flag. So my understanding right now is that there's a CRC32 algorithm, which acts as a sticky sort of segmentation method, where anytime you input that user ID or that rollout percentage, you're always going to get put into the same groupings. At least that's my understanding of the current stickiness.
Yeah, so I mean, in part, this is like indeterminate percentage of actors, and like with the increasing percentage, you increase the influence, but you keep the ones on the lower percentage. But the tricky part about that is like, it's in the case that you're describing is user-based. It's either one of those. It's either user-based or either it's session-based. Like the current feature flag engine doesn't allow you to make the both at the same time. Let's say like, because like you mentioned about the varied concept, like we also want to track anonymous user. We want to track anonymous user going through the new registration flow, and it becomes then registered user. And it's basically want this registered user then to be part of the experiment group, because I mean, this is what it means stickiness really, in that sense, that like you stick based on some, let's say, event, and the event here would be like a new session generated, but this kind of like event that allowed you to be exposed to this experiment sticks with you because you are this user, regardless of the session that you are using. I'm kind of like thinking here, if we do stickiness based on session, you open mobile browser on your phone, you're gonna have different session. It's the same user, but different session. And the stickiness here would be rather that, like you started as anonymous before a login, you were shown a new login flow. You were exposed to some changes. It kind of stays with you. It's kind of like a virus that you are being exposed on all devices that you are using at some point.
It's a good example, very relevant to the times. Yeah, that's exactly it. You get put into an experiment as an anonymous user, you log in, you're still in that experiment, and you switch a device. Maybe now you use your phone and you log in and you're still part of that experiment. I think that's a good way to describe the stickiness. But I'd say that that's probably a less important use case for us right now. We're still trying to just get basic A/B testing working well, where we can easily roll out A/B tests and easily find out, what the conversion rates are.
So can you describe in a few words what does mean conversion and when it happens? What are the criteria?
Yeah, so this idea of a conversion is when you do an A/B test, you should define your conversion event so that you can tell whether someone, successfully converted or not. So what this might be is you've got an A/B test of, different buttons that you want to test. And your conversion event may be the number of people that actually click on each button. So you're testing like a green button versus a red button. You show that to 50% of each of your groups. And you want to see, did green convert better or did red convert better? So that conversion event would be fired as soon as someone clicks on that button.
Okay, so basically it's like feature flag defines whether you are in the control or experiment based on like the rollout percentage. But the snowplow is like something that generates event when something happens. And you may be including information whether like that event was generated for the given conditions in which like the system was running. It could be user session, being part of the control or experiment or some other criteria that we may be interested to graph.
Yeah, this is a very simple example. I think what we're looking for is a way to correlate some user who is in an experimental group with future events. So for example, creation of namespaces versus people who are not in the experimental group. So that's a more complicated time spanning process that we want to say whether somebody is converted or not.
So like, can you like provide like the concrete example of this namespace? How it would look like? We test like a new namespace flow, or like we test a button flow that then may lead to different namespace flow. Like how it looks.
Yeah. So for example, I was working on an issue where we show new users who signed up and who are part of the experimental group some pre-filled project with some issues in the project where we teach the user about features of GitLab.
Mm-hmm.
And we hope that by doing so, they interact with the product more and create more groups. So a user would have successfully converted when they create more groups than somebody who was in the control group.
Okay, but I mean like but like the experiment that we are running is like it was creation of the like project that is pre-filled with some data, right? This was our criterion that we are testing against, right?
Yeah, that's what we showed the users of the experimental group.
And like we were curious about if user presented with that data would create like more data
In the future, yeah, in a certain time span, yeah. So that's why we need to record a user ID in, for example, if we just rely on Snowplow, we don't have a user ID to correlate new namespaces that are created. Unless on every namespace creation, we send a Snowplow event with the same hash that's correlated to the user.
Yeah, so it seems really like that the identifiers are pretty important to be able to find this trail of operations.
For analysis, yes, yeah.
Thank you, it makes sense to me.
Yeah, it looks like something that we definitely need to explore. We're a little bit over time, so I think we'll stop now. But we can definitely continue asynchronously, or even just have another sync meeting if you prefer. Camille, we didn't get to your point.
It's kind of like informatory, not really anything serious. Maybe with OneNote, like the documentation is updated to new flow, but it's not required yet. So you may use, you may not use. But if you use, you're gonna provide a useful feedback how this flow looks. So there is an epic where you can create an issue about all improvements, like what do you want to see different, and we could still save it before like much wider rollout. What I'm now really trying to do is like kind of do like percentage rollout on the GitHub developers. Basically, start with the small control group, with the small experiment group, and see how they feel about that, and what else we can improve, and kind of like spread the octopus later further over like next weeks.
Great. So thank you all for joining. And then I'll post this video later.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for the feedback. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Hey.